Hey everyone, it's Skylar here from Weavium, and today we're going to be doing another tutorial with the fluid stack. Specifically, we're going to be making a model or a modal for a website. So I'll show you guys how to do that, and first I'll show you what we're going to be making. So here in our website browser, we've got this simple container with some text and a button that says Show Model. When we click it, the modal appears, and when we click the close button, it hides again. So again, we click the button, it fades in, slides up. Click the close button, it fades out, slides down. So this is what we are going to be making today. So let's just close this out, and we're going to go back over to RapidWeaver, and we're going to start from scratch. So the first thing we're going to do is just create a new project. Then we are going to add a stacks page where we can put our fluid stack. We're going to open up the library, search for fluid, and here you will see all of the fluid stacks that come when you install it. What we need to do first is click on this main fluid stack and drag it onto our page. So, as you can see, when you first drag the fluid stack onto our page, inside of it we get this state manager. And every fluid stack has one state manager inside of it surrounding all of your content. You don't have to use it if you don't want to. In fact, you could just delete the state in there and just use whatever content you want inside of here for a layout, or you can add states and use them as you wish. In our case, we're going to be using the state manager, and I'll show you how that works a little bit later on. So the first thing we need to do, if we're going back to our example, is we need to add in the main container, right? So I'm going to drag this container stack right here. You notice fluid has all these stacks. We've got a container stack, and a container stack is basically a pretty awesome row column stack that comes with fluid that allows you to make basically anything you can imagine. So we're going to drag this container stack inside of our state manager right here, and then you'll notice we've got all of these great options on the container stack. Tons of alignment and styling options for everything you need. So what we're going to do is we're going to start from the top, and we're going to work our way down, setting up this main container. So at the top we've got this optional name property, and you don't have to use it, but you can. It's nice for organizing things. We're going to name ours main wrapper, and then you'll see in the settings mode we've got a nice little title above our container, so we can see how things are going to be organized. Next we've got the fill mode, which we are going to leave to grow, which means it just fills the entire space. The alignment, we're also going to leave it as is for now. And then the overflow, etc. is all going to stay as it is. The only thing we're going to do here is we're going to go down to the styles section. We're going to add a background, which is just going to be a single color. And we're going to set that to just a light gray. Then we're going to go, we're going to add a radius of say 20 pixels and maybe a padding of 25 pixels. And that's going to be it for now. So if we preview this in our browser, you'll see we've got this empty container here at the top. And I'm going to do some styling here that'll make it a little bit easier for you guys to see. It's not necessary, but you can do this if you want to. So I'm going to go to the main fluid stack up here, which has some general max width properties. I'm going to set the max width to 1000 pixels, and then I'm also going to add a margin on the top and bottom of 100 pixels. And so what this is going to do is it's going to give us a nice little centered container. That'll be easier for you guys to see as we go along through this tutorial. The next thing I'm going to do now that I think about it, is I'm going to add a min height to this outer container. That'll make it easier for our layout. So if I go to the min height, I type 600 pixels, you'll notice that the min size, max size, and margin, they all have their own custom units. And this is so that you can do things like percentages and pixels and more inside of these inputs. You're not limited to just one unit. So we're going to set the min height of this container to 600 pixels. And now if we go back to our browser and refresh, you'll see we've got this nice container like we had at the beginning. So the next thing we're going to do is we're just going to add some basic content. I mean, in the end, the content that you add will be up to you, but in our case, we'll just add a few things to make it look nice. So we'll go into the library, and we're still searching for fluid. So we've got all of our fluid stacks. And what we're going to do is we're going to take this fluid text stack here, and we're going to drag it into our container. And the fluid text stack is really useful. It's basically a text stack that can be used for anything. It can be used for text, HTML, or if you notice over here, you can also use it as a markdown stack. And it's got all of these nice properties on it, such as visibility, opacity, color, font size, style, alignment, margin, rotation, you name it, it's got it. So in our case, we're going to add a little title and then a small description text below that. So let's go to the top of the text stack. We can leave it fill mode to shrink. For the fill mode on the text, basically shrink means that the text is in line. It's kind of a single word piece of text rather than a paragraph that's going to be wrapping to multiple lines. And in our case, we're going to leave it to shrink. We're also going to leave this content type to text HTML, just the basic. Leave the color at black. We're going to set the font size to something larger, maybe 26 pixels. And we're going to set it to bold. Now we can go ahead and click in our stack, and we're just going to say content title. Perfect. Okay, so that's it for the title. Next we're going to Command C on this text and Command V to copy it. And now for this paragraph text, we're going to do something a little bit differently. We're going to change the font size down to 15 pixels, remove the bold styling, and we're going to decrease the opacity of this color to 50%. That'll just make it look a little bit nicer. And then for our description, we're just going to say click the button below to show the modal. Okay. And so if we preview this in our browser now, we'll have these two pieces of text at the top of our container. What we really want to do, let's go back to this main wrapper, fluid container. And you'll notice at the top, below the fill mode, we've got our content alignment options. We can choose to align the content from top to bottom or left to right. And then we've also got these vertical and horizontal alignment options. So what we're going to do for our example is just set the vertical alignment to center and the horizontal alignment to center. And if we go back to our browser and refresh, you'll see that our content is just that. It's centered in the middle. So this is perfect, just how we want it. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to go back to the library, and we're going to add a button that we can use later to trigger our model or modal. So we're going to drag this button right here inside of our container below our text, and you'll notice with the button, similar to the text, we've got all of these nice options: fill, max width, visibility for showing, hiding, opacity, color, background, hover background, font size, radius, padding, margin with custom units, border, etc. Basically all of the stacks that come with Fluid, container, button, icon, images, text, they all have these similar options for customizing your layout, which is really great. So in our case, for our button, let's go ahead and change the button text first. It's just going to say show modal. So when we click on our button, we're going to show modal. We're going to leave the fill mode at shrink. I'll show you right now what happens if we change the fill mode of the button to grow. So if we set the button fill mode to grow, and we go back and look at our page, you'll see that our button is now stretching the full width of our container. That's what happens when you set it to grow. But in our case, we're going to leave it to shrink. And if I show you what that looks like, it's just a typical button, which is what we want. The next thing we're going to do here is we're going to go down and add a margin to the top of the button. We'll set that to something like 20 pixels, and we will refresh the page. Okay, this is good enough for this example. We're going to have a container here, a title at the top, some short description text, and a button that we will use to trigger our modal. Okay, so now let's move on to the next step, which is we're going to be creating our modal. So if we go to the library, we're again going to be using the container, similar to the way we used a container to make the main wrapper. So we're going to take a container and we're going to drag it inside of our fluid state manager, but above our main wrapper. And the reason why we're going to put it outside of this wrapper is because our modal is going to be fixed to the page. And whenever we've got fixed elements, we want them to be not inside any wrappers. So we're going to put it here, and just like we named our container before, we're also going to name this one as well. We're going to give it a name of modal, and perfect. And we're also going to leave the fill mode to grow, leave the alignment as it is for now, and we're going to work our way down. So the first thing we're going to do here is we're going to set a background color. And the default background color is this nice sort of bluish, grayish color. In our case, we will set it to something blue, maybe to match our button below. Okay, so then we're going to go down and we're going to set a max width for our model. Maybe we will set it to 700 pixels because we don't want our model to be displaying the full width of the page, right? In this case, we're also going to add a min height really quickly of 500 pixels. So that means that our model must be at least 500 pixels tall, and it's going to be the full width as we've set up here in our fill mode to grow, but the maximum width it can be is 700 pixels. Okay, and then the last thing we're going to do is add a radius of 20 pixels and a padding of 25 pixels. Okay, so now let's go ahead and take a look at this in our browser. So you notice we've got our model, but it's not fixed to the page. It's just sort of sitting above our container here, right? So let's go ahead and I'll show you how to fix it to the page. So with the container stack in Fluid, at the very, very bottom, we've got this nice section for positioning. And this positioning section allows you to set Fluid containers inline, as it is now, absolute, which means that it's kind of floating inside of its parent container, or fixed, which is that it is floating in relation to the browser window, or basically it's sticky. As you scroll, it's going to stay with you, right? If it's set to absolute, it's not going to scroll with you. It's going to be floating in its container. But fixed means it's going to scroll with you and be fixed to the browser window. In our case, fixed is exactly what we want. And so if you click on the fixed position option, you'll notice that we now get these self-alignment buttons as well. We can align it vertically and horizontally as we want to. Notice how none of them are selected at first. And that is because by default, any fluid container will inherit the alignment of its parent. In this case, it doesn't have a parent container, so we're going to set these options ourselves. And for our model, we just want it to be centered on the screen, right? Vertically and horizontally. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to click center here and center here. And so now, if we go back to our page and refresh, oh, you'll notice we can't see the model, but it is centered. And you might be wondering why that is. And that is because of z-index. And so if we go to our container and we look in the styles options, you'll see we've got a z-index here. And all containers are set to 1000 z-index by default. But if we want this z-index or this container to be on top of other containers, we need to give it a higher z-index value. So in this case, we're just going to give it something really high, like 5,000. So if we do that and we go back to our page and refresh, you'll see now we've got this fixed model above our container. Great. So now let's go back and we will add some content to our modal. Okay? So we're going to go back to the library. We're going to grab a fluid text stack, put it inside, and we're going to begin editing. So again, we will go straight to the styles options. We'll set the style of the text. In this case, let's just set it to white. We'll give it a font size of maybe 24 pixels and a style of bold. Now we'll also really quickly give it a margin on the bottom of maybe 15 pixels because we are going to Command C, Command V, copy this text and just create a little bit of paragraph text here. So here for this paragraph text, we're going to change the font size to 15 pixels. We're going to remove the bold and remove the margin, set it back to 0 pixels, and then we're going to change the color. We're going to leave it at white, but we're going to change the opacity to something like 50%. That'll be a clear indication of paragraph text. Also what we want to do, we want this to be in paragraphs, but we don't want to add multiple text stacks. So what we can do here is we can go to the settings panel of the text stack for fluid, and we will change it from text HTML to markdown. And this will allow us to add markdown content inside of it. And we want to create some lorem ipsum text that we can put in there. So we're going to go back to our browser, open a new tab, and we're going to search for some lorem ipsum text. I use a website called Hipster Ipsum. It's really useful for creating sort of modern lorem ipsum text. You just go here, click this funny button, hear me, and then you've got all of this paragraph text. I'm just going to copy this first paragraph, go back into our text stack, highlight all this, and delete it, and then I'm going to paste this paragraph. And I'm going to paste it a couple of times. And because our text stack is set to markdown, this space will now separate these paragraphs into actual paragraph tags in the markdown. Great. So the next thing we need to do is add an icon at the top of our modal, and it's going to be for closing the modal when we click on the icon. And the great thing about Fluid is it comes with all of the building blocks you need for your layout. So we don't have to go and use any other stacks to create this. Fluid comes with its own icon stack. So all you have to do is take the Fluid icon stack and drag it to the top of our modal here. Okay, and so for the icon, you'll see just like all the other Fluid stacks, it's got these nice options for visibility, showing and hiding, opacity, color, icon size, margin, you name it, it's got it. So the first thing we're going to do here is we're going to change the color to white, and we're going to add a little bit of margin on the bottom, maybe 15 pixels. Separate it from the other content. The next thing we're going to do is change this icon code. So for the icons, it's pretty simple. If you notice, we'll have this icon font and icon code properties. So if we click on the drop down, we've got all of these different icon fonts that we can use. We can use icons, linear icons, material icons, font awesome, custom icon font where you provide your own URL, an icon image from a link, so it's basically just an image, or an image from the RapidWeaver settings panel, which is basically a file on your computer. In our case, we're going to leave it at material icons, and then now we just have to type in the icon code. Typically for this, you would go into your browser and you would go to material.io/tools/icons, and then you'll see here that we've got a whole list of icons. As soon as the page loads, here we go. Now we've got a full list of icons with the codes. You can just type in the icon code exactly as it shows here with the underscores. But in our case, I actually already know the code for the icon that we're going to use. It's really simple. I'm just going to type in close, and the close icon is just a simple X. Okay? So now we've got our modal, which is fixed to the page. We've got our icon at the top, a title text, and some paragraph text. So if we go back to our page, we'll close this tab, and we'll refresh, and we'll have our modal right here with our icon, our text, and our paragraph text here. And notice how our modal is just a little bit taller than the content. That's fine, but really quickly what I'm going to do is I'm going to go here, click on our modal container, and I'm going to remove this min height that we added earlier, reset it to 0 pixels. I basically just added that so that we could see the modal without any content inside of it. So now if I refresh the page, the modal is going to fit to the size of our content, and it's exactly as we need it. Okay, so now that we've got everything set up, the next thing we want to do is we want to start adding transforms and states in our layout. So the first thing we want to do before we get started is we want to add a state to our layout. So where we do that is in the state manager. And the state manager contains states for our layout. And states are basically switches that can be turned on and off. And when a switch or when a state is turned on, we can change the content in our layout. So for example, we can change this modal to be hidden or shown, right? So in this case, we're going to click on our state and we're going to give it a name. And we will call this show modal. We'll just call it show modal state. Okay? And it's going to be set to off first. Okay, so now our state is set up, show modal state. And later we can change the state to on, and we will use that to show our modal. So the first thing you may be wondering is we don't want our modal to be showing all the time. We only want it to be showing when we click on our show modal button, right? So that's a good point. We really need to go to this modal, and we want to go here and we want to set some of the settings to be different. We could use visibility. We could change the visibility from show to hide. But the thing about that is there won't be any nice animation or effect. So instead what we're going to do is we're going to give this a margin top of 100%. And we're also going to give it an opacity of 0. So now if we go back and look at our page, our modal is going to be gone. And what happened to it is that the opacity is set to 0, so it's completely faded out. And then it's got a margin top of 100%. And margin is always based relative to the container, which in our case is our window. So it is pushed 100% down. So it's down here out of sight, and the opacity is set to 0. So now it's out of the way, which is just what we want. Because we want, when we click this button, the model to kind of fade in and slide up, right? So let's go ahead and do that now. So because we've got our state now, we can go ahead and add a transform to our model. And if you notice, at the top of each fluid stack, we've got this unique little button here. And you might be wondering what this button is. I haven't talked about it up until now, purposefully because I wanted to save it for this portion of the tutorial. But what this button is it is a transform button. And it comes with all fluid stacks. And basically when you click on it, it adds a transform inside of that fluid stack. So because we clicked on the one inside of our Modal container, it added a transform to this container. And you'll notice that it has a name, a container transform, and it says apply on, and it's got this state name here. And the state name is according to the state in our content, right? So whenever this state is turned on, this transform is going to be applied. So if we click on our transform and we look in the settings panel, you'll see here at the top we could change the name if we wanted. We could say Modal transform, and then we can change the state that we want this transform to be applied on. And remember that in our state manager, we added a state called show modal state. So that's when we want this transform to be applied. So we're going to do that now. Show modal state. And so you'll see here our modal transform, and it's going to be applied when the show modal state is set to on. Right now it's set to off. So if we stay clicked on our transform and we go down into the transform styles option, you'll notice that similar to the fluid container stack, we've got all of the same options. We've got visibility for show hide, text color, background opacity, z-index, minimum size, maximum size, radius, padding, margin, border, shadow, etc. It's all there. Just like the container, we can transform all of those styles. Another thing you'll notice is that there is a small checkbox above each property, and that is so that you can pick and choose which properties you want to transform. In our case, if we go back to our container, our modal container, click on it, remember that we set the opacity to 0, and we also added a margin top of 100%. So what we want to do on our transform, if you click back onto it, we want to basically undo that, right? So we want to transform our opacity, and we want to transform our margin as well. So if we click on this checkbox to transform the opacity, now this property will be transformed when the show model state is on. And you'll also notice that when we click on a checkbox, we get these two timing options, which allow us to set the speed of the transform and also to add a delay. In our case, we are not going to be editing these options. We'll just leave them as they are. Also, the opacity is already set to 1 by default, so simply checking this option will now make it display. Now let's go down, and remember that we added a margin of 100%, so we are going to undo that. So we will simply check this transform margin option. We'll leave the timing, speed, and delay as they are, and we actually don't need to change anything because the default is already set to 0 pixels. So just as a recap, let's go back to the top of this transform and take a look at what's going on. So this transform is being applied when the show model state is set to on, and when the show model state is set to on, we are going to transform the following properties. Transform the opacity to 1, and we are going to transform the margin back to 0. Okay, so that is really it when it comes to adding the transform to show our model. We just have to change those properties. So if we go into our state manager here at the top, if we click on our show model state, it's off by default, but if we turn this on and then go ahead and look at our page, you'll notice that our modal is now showing up because the show modal state here is turned to on, our transform is being applied, and our opacity is being set back to 1, and our margin is being set back to 0. So we can go ahead and turn this off again, and our model will be hidden as it was before. So this is great. We want our model to be showing and hiding when the show modal state changes, but we don't want to be changing it here in the settings panel. Instead, we want to add a trigger into our content so that when a user interacts with our content, the show modal state turns on and the modal appears, right? So we're going to go down to our content section. Remember, we wanted it so that when the user clicks on this button, the modal appears. So how can we do this? How can we trigger this state to on in our content? Well, for that we use the fluid trigger stack. So if we go into the library, stacks library, you'll see right here we've got this fluid trigger stack. And these triggers can be used to turn states on and off based on different interactions from users, such as click, hover, scroll, or browser resize. So let's go ahead and take this trigger and we will drag it right above our button. So if we go back down to where our button's at, now we've got this trigger. So if we click on our trigger and we go over to the settings panel, you'll see we've got these 3 sections. The first section is when to trigger. We've got a little change on drop down here that will allow us to choose what interaction will trigger this content or trigger this state change. So you'll notice we've got a click, hover, scroll, and window resize, as I mentioned. So we're going to leave it on click. And then the next thing we're going to do is go to this section below, which is what states to trigger. And so basically, here we can say which states in our state manager up here we want to change. And in our case, remember we've got the show modal state, which we want to change. So in our trigger settings panel, we are going to change this toggle option to the show modal state. And you may be wondering what these 3 different sections here are. I'll kind of explain them briefly. This toggle section is for switching states to their opposite. So basically, if a state is set to off by default, notice how this one is off, then whenever the trigger is clicked, it will be turned on. Otherwise, if the state is already on, it will be switched to off. So that's what toggle does, it switches it to its opposite. Below here, we've also got an on-only section and an off-only section. And basically what these do is they only turn a state from one mode to another. So either if it's in the on section, it'll go from off to on, but it won't toggle back to off. And if it's in the off section, it will go from on to off, but it won't go back the other way around. So this is when you only want to turn it on or off. You won't always be using these. Mostly you'll be using this toggle section, which is why it is the default. You can use all 3 at once if you'd like to, but mostly you'll be sticking to the toggle section. Okay, so great. If we look in our settings panel here, in RapidWeaver, you'll see trigger states when this content is clicked, and then it's going to toggle the show modal state. So the only thing we need to do now is add some content inside of our trigger that can be clicked. So what we're going to do is just take our button here and place it right inside of our trigger. And that is it. So if we go back to our page and we refresh, now, because our trigger is surrounding our show modal button, when we click on it, the show modal state is going to be turned on, and then our transform is going to be applied to our modal. So when the transform is applied, the opacity is brought back to 1 and the margin is set back to 0, bringing it back here, right? And so you'll notice now we don't really have a way to close our modal. And that's because we need to add another trigger somewhere inside of our modal. Right now we can't really click on anything because our modal is blocking our button. If we refresh the page, it will go back to its original state. And if we click on the Show Modal button, it'll appear. So now what we want to do is we want to add another trigger surrounding our icon so that when we click it, it toggles the modal state back to off. So let's go ahead and do that. We'll go back into our Contents section, go into our Modal. We're going to go back to the library for another fluid trigger. We're going to drag this trigger to the top of our modal, like so. We're going to go into the settings panel for the trigger. We're going to leave it at click, right? And here in the toggle, again, we're going to change the show modal state, right? And now all we have to do is drag our icon inside of our trigger, and boom. Now when this icon is clicked, the show modal state is going to be triggered and it's going to work. So let's go back to our page, refresh, we click on the model, our transform is applied, and now because our trigger is surrounding our icon, when we click on it, our show modal state is turned back off, is toggled back off. So that's it. Now we've got a nice working modal that we've just created in just a few steps. I just want to recap really quickly for us so we can remember what we did. We've created our layout, right? Our container with buttons, and we've created a modal with some text and an icon. We have set our modal to fixed position, center, center. And we have also set the margin to 100% so that it's completely outside of the window. And we've also set the opacity to 0, so that's hidden initially. Then we have gone ahead and added a transform to our modal, which turns the opacity back to 1 and also returns the margin back to 0. We have added a state inside of our state manager, show modal state, which can be switched on and off. And then we have added triggers in our layout, which when clicked toggle the show modal state on and off. We've wrapped one around our icon, and we have wrapped